What is truth? That's the question that Pilate asks Jesus. It's a scandalous question to come out of a Roman governor's mouth. He's the governor of Judea, with the power to decide who lives and who dies. Yet here in the Gospel of John, Pilate asks, what is truth? It's John's way of saying that this Roman governor and his whole imperial government have no right to rule. How can you distribute justice if you don't know what truth is? How can you decide whether Jesus should be executed if you don't know what truth is? John's saying that this authoritarian government is foolish, cruel, and represents everything that is wrong in the world at his time. John wants us to see that dictatorships are no way to run a nation, that there's another, better way of ruling the world, one that is inspired by the values that Jesus has been teaching. But this little scene in the gospel poses another question about the Bible itself. The scene itself is actually very easy to imagine. Jesus has been bound and he's standing before Pilate. Here's a famous painting of the scene. A few guards stand nearby to make sure that this prisoner doesn't escape, but we've been told very clearly in the text that the Jewish leaders are outside. They don't want to come into a Gentile's building just before Passover. That would ritually defile them, so they're not coming inside. So if the Jewish leaders are outside and the disciples are nowhere close by, and there's just Romans in the room with Jesus and Pilate, then who's taking notes? Who is it that says that Pilate ever asked, what is truth? Were the guards taking notes? Did they remember? Did Pilate tell one of Jesus' disciples, hey, here's what I said to Jesus when he came up to me? Doesn't seem very likely. The most likely answer is that John invented this dialogue decades later based on stories that were told by the disciples and Jesus' first followers. But that, of course, raises another thorny issue. These words are recorded in the Gospel of John, but if you flip through the rest of the New Testament, you won't find them in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. They all have scenes of Jesus being before Pilate, but he doesn't say these words. In fact, the four Gospels are often in quite significant disagreement with each other. In the Gospel of John, Jesus goes back and forth between Jerusalem. He goes back and forth many, many times. In the other Gospels, he only goes to Jerusalem once his ministry starts, and that's that last week where he gets killed and arrested and pulled before Pilate. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus doesn't want people to know that he's the Messiah. Everybody who figures it out, he says, shh, don't tell anybody. Whereas in John's Gospel, he's saying it from the very beginning. Jesus is very forthright. I'm the Messiah. People should be listening to me. In Matthew's Gospel, there's that famous Sermon on the Mount. In Luke's Gospel, it's the Sermon on the Plain, and the words are not exactly the same. So from the beginning, people have asked, how do we trust the Gospels if they're saying such different stories about Jesus? There's only one guy. How can there be so many different stories? And how can we believe any one gospel if it doesn't agree with the other gospels? Well, the existence of these four different accounts of Jesus' life reflects a way of understanding what is truth. And let me give you an example. Take this chair. Okay, we all recognize that this chair is real. It's physically right there. There's only one chair up here on the chancel stage. If you look at the chair from the front, it looks like it only has two legs because the front legs are right in front of the back legs. So you only see two legs. So if you wanted to sketch this chair, you might get the mistaken impression that it only has two legs. To understand that it's got four legs, you'd have to come to the side and see it from the side. But even standing here, looking at it from the side, I can't tell what it's like on the other side. I don't know if there's engravings on the legs, or maybe they're a different color. I can't tell. And I also can't tell how thick those legs are. Maybe they're really thin or maybe they're very thick. I just can't tell from this angle. So I would have to go around to see it from this perspective. But even from these three perspectives, I still can't tell what the back of the chair looks like. Is it thick? Is it thin? Is it painted a different color? Does it say kick me? I don't know. To really understand this chair, you have to see it from all sorts of different angles, including from above and from below. And that's what the gospel writers and the Christians who followed them thought was going on with the Gospels. They said to really understand Jesus, you need to see Jesus from multiple angles. And they weren't hung up on the fact that the details weren't the same. They didn't mind that at all. They said, well, Luke wants us to understand Jesus as a kind of priest, and that's why his story starts in the temple with Zechariah and Elizabeth. Whereas Matthew wants us to understand Jesus' humanity, so he's constantly emphasizing Christ's physical nature and his personality. Whereas John likes to talk about Jesus in high theological terms. He's the most spiritual of the four Gospels. And that's why when they decided to make icons of each of the Gospel writers, they chose an eagle for John's Gospel, because he's the one who takes the meaning of Christ's ministry to the highest heights. And Mark is much more solid, and he's sort of like the action novel version of the Gospels. It's just one action thing after another, and so he's the more practical. Here's just the facts. He's the dragnet version of the Gospels. And they didn't mind that all of these stories didn't happen at the same time and in the same places, because they saw that each story was trying to give us a different perspective on what it meant for God to have become a human being. So they looked at Jesus from all these different angles. So they were not embracing a literal understanding of Jesus. We hear so much about, you got to understand the Bible literally. Well, if you do that, then you'd have to throw away at least 3 of the Gospels. And back in the early days, there were some people who said, it doesn't make sense that the details don't all add up, so let's just have one gospel. And they tried to harmonize the Gospels. And the early Christians said, no, that's too thin. Because what they wanted was for us to see reality the way God sees reality. They wanted to lift us out of that narrow kind of perspective, which humans live in so often, and instead see the world from God's point of view, which means seeing it from all the angles simultaneously. And for providing 4 different versions of Jesus, they said, this is how God sees things, from all the angles at once. So having 4 versions gets us closer to understanding God's perspective. And they literally said, you know what? It had to be 4 perspectives, because there's 4 points on the compass. And there's 4 winds. And back then they believed that the earth was held up by pillars, and they said there were 4 pillars that hold up the earth. 4 was a symbol of completeness, and the world was built. There were 4 corners of the earth. So it made sense that there would be 4 Gospels, because it would give us the most complete view of this person called Jesus. Okay, that's great. God can see things from all angles. But that's pretty hard for us, right? As regular human beings, we tend to see things just one angle at a time. So how do we see the world the way God does? Well, the rest of the Gospels show the way. The key, Christ says over and over again, is that we should be helping the poor and the oppressed and anyone who is suffering. Get to know them. Find out what the world looks like from their perspective. When you help them, Jesus says, you are helping me. Or to put it another way, when you get closer to the poor and the marginalized, you're getting closer to Christ, the source of all. Now, it's easy to see Jesus as the king of nice, right? We help people who are suffering because that's the nice thing to do. And that's true, but if you look through the healing stories, Jesus wants us to understand something else too. Word got out that Jesus could heal people, all sorts of people brought their friends and relatives who were ill to Jesus so that he could use his healing touch to help them. And we know from the Gospels that there were certain occasions, like when the centurion said, "My servant is suffering. Can you help him?" Jesus said, "Oh, because of your faith, he's healed already." So we know that Jesus can heal at a distance. He doesn't have to physically touch someone to heal them. He can just say it and it happens. And we can debate what that really means in terms of what actually happened on that day. But within the story of the Bible, we are given the information that Jesus can heal at a distance. But most of the time, he doesn't. Most of the time, someone will walk up to him, say a blind person or a lame person or someone who's been possessed or someone who's sick, and his first question for them is, "What do you want me to do?" He doesn't just see them coming and go, "Poof, poof, poof, you're healed, you're healed, you're healed." He doesn't assume. Instead, he asks them, "What do you want?" He doesn't assume just because you're blind, you want to have your blindness cured. Maybe you're anxious or you're suffering from trauma. Maybe that's what you need help with. He doesn't assume, he asks. And the Gospels record this over and over again because he must have done it so often. They couldn't help but record it over and over again. And why does that matter? Because it means that Jesus is pulling us aside and saying, "Watch this. When you help people, you can't just wave a magic wand or write a check and poof. Instead, you got to ask them, what's your story? What do you need? What does the world look like from your point of view?" You have to have a relationship with them. What he's saying is, how we treat the oppressed is just as important as who they are. Jesus wants us to get close and see the world from their perspective and hear it in their own words, to see life from their angle, not just from ours. So perhaps a modern example will help unpack this a little bit. Tomorrow's National Housing Day, as I mentioned in the preamble to that video. And it's a time when we're encouraged to think about why is it that not everybody is housed in this country. Most of the media attention tomorrow will probably be focused on the homeless, right? As a culture, we're fascinated by people who end up on the streets. They are the poster children of the marginalized for us at this time. In my time serving on the Community Liaison Committee for the Roehampton Shelter, almost every meeting somebody asks, "Okay, who's in the shelter now?" And the staff keeps statistics on this. They can tell us most of the people in the shelter are men. The average age is around 45. There's some couples, but most people are single. And people are fascinated by, okay, well, how did they end up there? What happened in their life that they ended up either on the street or in a shelter? The city collects a lot of data on who's homeless, as I mentioned in that video. And their identity is not a mystery. Most of them are men. The majority have experienced homelessness for over a year. Indigenous and racialized people make up a much higher percentage of them than they do in the general population. About half suffer from mental health issues. About a quarter have physical disabilities. Almost half have more than a high school education, and 5% have graduate degrees. All of them are poor, but most of them have some source of income, usually from the government. Now, this may seem to answer the question of why people are homeless, but it's incomplete. Because the truth is, yeah, sure, there are indigenous people who are homeless, but the vast majority of indigenous people are not homeless. Most homeless people are men, but the vast majority of men aren't homeless. There are certainly people who have substance abuse issues among the homeless, but the vast majority of people with drug addictions are not homeless. They're, taking their drugs in their homes. Most of the people with mental issues, mental health issues, don't end up in shelters, and they don't end up on the streets. These people are not experiencing homelessness because of their character traits, because those same character traits are found in the general population who are housed. When we focus on the person who doesn't have housing, we're implicitly suggesting that they are the author of their own misery. Who's in the shelter? What kind of people are in the shelter? Well, that's like assuming that the answer to that question will solve why they're in the shelter. But it's not that simple. The perspective's too narrow. It's like we're looking at that chair, but only from above. We're looking down on the homeless population, saying, oh, how did you get there? Our view is just like this, straight down. It's not godlike enough, it's not complete enough to show us the whole picture. Christ asks us to draw close to the oppressed because when we do, we discover not just their story, but our part in their story. They're not oppressed simply because they have particular character traits. They're oppressed because the society around them doesn't want to talk about what it's done to put them there, to make them marginalized. In Christ's day, for example, the people that the Bible calls lepers, they didn't have leprosy the way we understand it. It was just a general term for skin rashes. And people with skin rashes weren't allowed to go to the temple because they were considered unclean. And if you had a skin rash that lasted more than a couple of months, that was it. You were never going to temple. You'd just be excluded. So those people were excluded from every aspect of life in ancient Israel. But the thing is, they could plow, they could cook meals, they could do everything a normal person could. They just happened to have a skin rash. You could have eczema and be in this situation. The society decided that a skin rash was a problem that was big enough to make a person marginalized. It wasn't that they were actually dysfunctional with that skin rash. Our approach to homelessness is similar to that. Let me give you an example from another society. In Finland, homelessness has been almost wiped out. It's not that they solved any of the personality trait issues. People still have substance abuse issues in Finland. People have mental health breakdowns. Couples break up. People flee abusive households. All the reasons that people become homeless here pertain in Finland. But they decided to deal with it differently. What they did is they decided to dedicate money to special affordable apartment units. If you find yourself without a home, you're scooped up and you're presented with the opportunity to live in your own apartment. And there's apartment complexes where there are social workers who are there who, because you're staying there, you have to have appointments with them, and they'll sit down with you and they'll say, okay, so what happened? Well, I lost my job. Okay, well, let's help you find another job. I'm fleeing from an abusive relationship. Okay, well, let's help you with that. They decided to take all the kind of social work, social services stuff, which exists at the Roehampton shelter and other shelters, but to apply it to people who've got apartments that they can hang on to for at least a year. Now, it's not a free ride. They're expected to rejoin Finnish society, so they pay rent. And if they don't have the money for the rent, and it's not huge, but it is rent, they're expected to pay it back eventually. So it's not a free ride. But Finnish society has said, we don't want people to be homeless, so we're going to spend the money to make it possible for everybody to have a home, and we will help you get back on your feet. That is a doable thing, and they've been doing it. It's expected that homelessness will end completely by 2027, and they say that their program is much, much cheaper than the system they had before, which is similar to ours. You don't have to clear an encampment for $3 million if everybody's already got a place to live. Both Finland and Toronto have people who suffer from addiction and mental health breakdowns, but one society decided that that shouldn't have to lead to homelessness, whereas our society still thinks that that's acceptable. Homelessness is about social choices, not just personality traits. But we can only get to that conclusion if we decide to look at the problem from multiple angles, not just one. Today's scripture presents two options. Pilate, the head of the Roman government, can see that Christ is completely innocent. He can't for the life of him find a reason that he's guilty. Christ has committed no crime. But for political reasons, Pilate goes out and he asks the Jewish leaders, "What do you want me to do with this guy?" And they demand that he free a bandit, someone who lives by violence out on the margins of society. Pilate is a political animal, so he chooses to sacrifice the innocent Christ so he can keep the crowds under control. He has no interest in truth or justice, just power. Christ offers another way, one where truth and reality are seen from multiple angles simultaneously, where we plainly recognize that this world is not the way it should be, or even what it could be, that there is a better way. A kingdom is coming, but it's not yet fully of this world. It's aching to become a reality. The way we get there is to draw closer to God's way of seeing the world. And to do that, we're encouraged to draw close to those who are oppressed and marginalized, not just because they need help, but because when we draw close to them, we will learn our role in making them marginalized. It's like we'll see ourselves in the mirror for the first time and go, "Oh, this situation is not as simple as I thought it was." We will be healing our entire society when we try to heal those who have been marginalized. When we can see our situation from all sides, we will find new solutions and possibilities. By seeing reality more like God does, we will find ourselves closer to God. And we'll be closer to answering that question that Pilate could not answer. What is truth? Amen.